can popular history and historical integrity coexist? To help us find out, we're going to have a panel discussion. We've already met Neil, of course. His historical training in the field of archaeology he's also navigated the world of popular history. He's brought it home to many of our lounge rooms, so now he's frequently in mine and those of my students in a sort of existential way. Neil's going to be joined by Dr. Michael McKernan. Michael's an historian and writer, extensive experience in teaching and research, management, the media, and practical representation of history. Dr. McKernan lectured in Australian history at the University of New South Wales before becoming Deputy Director of the Australian War Memorial here in Canberra. He was involved in directing and inspiring the renewal of the memorial. He's also an advisor to the ABC, appears weekly on ABC Radio, and is also author of The Brumbies, Drought, and The Strength of a Nation. Will we please welcome Dr. Michael McKernan? Our third panellist is Dr. Craig Stockings. He's an Associate Professor at the University of New South Wales, ADFA, here in Canberra. That's the Defence Force University site for those who are non-Canberrans. His main field of academic interest is Australian and international military history. In addition to a range of journal publications, some recent publications include Anzac's Dirty Dozen, 12 Myths of Australian Military History, and Bardia, Myth, Reality and the Heirs of Anzac. Dr. Stockings is also a qualified secondary school teacher with an ongoing interest in that profession, so he will have some different insights into this discussion as well. So could we welcome Dr. Stockings? And I know I did reintroduce Neil, but I did forget to welcome Neil again, so let's welcome Neil to the discussion panel. And as our chair for this panel discussion, we have Liz McGuinness, who is one of our committee members. She's also the head of social sciences at Marist College here in Canberra as well. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Liz.
Okay, thank you. Excellent. Can people hear me at the back? Much closer to the mouth. Is that better? Yes, we hope. I'm not used to one of these. I think with my Year 9 teacher voice, I could probably reach the back anyway, but we'll try and use it. Panel, we have an interesting task ahead of us from now until lunchtime, which is to tease out this question of popular history, what does that really mean, and historical integrity. And I think we need to question also, what does that really mean? And try and reach some sort of conclusion as to whether they are strange bedfellows or intimates. And I'm interested in each of your views on this. Also, because we didn't have questions earlier, I think the questions perhaps to Neil could well, from what you've just said, Neil, fit very well with this discussion as well. So we're more than happy to have questions from the audience. So if there's any burning issue that you would like to address to anyone on the panel, feel free. But we will hear from our panel members first, and then we'll see how everybody else wants to contribute. So, popular history, what actually is it? And historical integrity, what do we mean by that? Have we set up a straw man, or is there really some essential difference between the two? Craig, would you like to start on that, please?
Okay, thanks, Liz. I mean, this is quite a fascinating question, I think, and for me, as the pointy-headed academic on the panel, I guess, there's a pretty clear answer. Can popular history and historical integrity coexist? Of course they can. Not only can they, they do. My own field, as was mentioned, is military history, and I can give you a wide list of works, not only in book form, but documentaries as well, that I would consider to be popular in that they're mass consumed, but also to be very good history. Here's the rub though. For me, it's not a question of can good history be popular, but it is about that good history. Because there is also a lot, I could provide, not that I will, examples of historical works I would consider to be not good history, that is bereft of integrity, yet popularly consumed nonetheless. So the fallout of that is those two questions. What then constitutes historical integrity? Now, in my own mind, this has two elements. The first one I'd classify as purpose. Why was that work of history, in whatever form it takes, created? Now, for me and my own motivations, if that was created to illuminate the past, to reveal something, to provide some insight, to give us some snapshot into the human condition, well, they're the reasons that historians work. On the other hand, if this piece was constructed for the purpose of being popular, for the purpose of selling or making money or creating controversy, well, that's a different question. That might lead, I think often does, leads to different conclusions, different contents, different arguments. So that's the first element for integrity in my eyes. I guess the second I would call something like rigour. History is not historical fiction for me, as popular or romantic as that might be. It's not playing fast and loose with what actually occurred. It's real effort and it's real research. There are a lot of paths and ways to do that. And I'm not suggesting for a moment that any book that you pick up, if it was going to have historical integrity, then half the page needs to be full of footnotes. Not at all. But somewhere along the way, even in a documentary or even in a movie, that work has to be done. If those two things exist, then for me that piece has integrity. If it's popular or not is a different question. There's nothing to me that excludes a work from being having integrity and being historically worthwhile just because it's popular. And some of my colleagues would disagree. There is an element of academic snobbery getting around about popular history or populist history. I don't hold those views, but they are out there. I'll talk about those later if time permits, but I better give somebody else a turn.
Thank you. Perhaps we'll hear from Michael. Michael perhaps straddles both of the dichotomies in a way, even if they are false ones. Michael, with your background at the War Memorial, I wonder if you could perhaps talk to us a little about human interest as history, vis-a-vis big questions of significance. Because it certainly seems that the War Memorial is brilliant at promoting an understanding of the experience of Australian servicemen and often personalising that. I think we can see that in the changes that Brendan Nelson's introducing for Anzac Day and for the closing ceremonies each afternoon. Do you feel there's any tension at all between human interest and questions of historical significance?
Whoa. I didn't expect that. I think what you've done is hit on one of the greatest issues that perennially faces an institution as important in Australian national life as the Australian War Memorial is. And I've got about 10 or 15 different ideas running through my head, so let's try and just calm myself down. When we did, in 1994, the entombment of the unknown Australian soldier, we were aware that we're involved in something of great significance. I thought myself it was a silly idea. The soldier we would return from France would have been buried at least 75 years earlier. And were we likely to be perpetrating a fraud on the people of Australia by, if you like, manufacturing an event that they hadn't asked for? And one of those who also thought the idea was dangerous was the then Governor-General of Australia, Bill Hayden. And he had been designated in the ceremony as the chief mourner. One of his tasks was to walk directly behind the gun carriage that carried the coffin of the unknown Australian soldier up Anzac Parade and into the Hall of Memory at the memorial. And I had a lot to do with Mr. Hayden in those days. And a couple of days before the ceremony, he said to me, "I'm terribly nervous about this. I am terribly nervous. I have this frequent nightmare that the gun carriage, the horses, the soldiers, the band, me, the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, a Marshal of the Air Force from Great Britain, a huge cast of characters set off at the foot of Anzac Parade and begin the walk up, and people lining the sides start to laugh. And that was Bill Hayden's nightmare. Anyway, for those of you that remember the activity, it went extraordinarily well. It was a remarkable event in the life of Australia, and and remains, as it was intended to be, the centrepiece now of the commemorative area of the Australian War Memorial. And I was feeling fairly relaxed when everything had gone okay. And I got a call from Government House, and I was asked if I could go over and see the Governor-General before I went home. So I did. And he said, I needed to tell you this today. And I thought, oh. And he said, we set off, the gun carriage and I, with the band in front, playing very significant music. And I looked into the faces of the tens of thousands of people lining Anzac Parade, and I saw an expression on Australian faces that I had never in my life seen before. And I said, and what did you see? He said, a deep love, a complete involvement, and although, you know me, Michael, I haven't got a spiritual bone in my body, a profound spirituality. And until that point, I hadn't realised that that was also part of the Australian makeup. Now, here you had an event that could have been a popular disaster, a manufactured thing, modelled on what had been done in London in 1920, in Paris in 1920 and so on, and done in Australia, in Canberra for God's sake, in 1993, and yet it could have had that impression. So I'm in total agreement with Craig, as usual. I believe that whatever we do in history, so long as we do it for a good reason, for a good purpose, then that is fine. And I also agree completely with Neil for that wonderful image he gave us of a program perhaps, being jam with some pills of real worth in it. And if I can just conclude with one other story, I started working on a project for 2015, which will be an 8-part drama series. And I went up and I was locked in a room with the 3 scriptwriters and also the head of the television company that's making it. And the bloke who was the head of the television company said, I just want to let you know how we're going to see the very beginning of this marvellous drama of an Australian family during the First World War. I said, okay. He said, well, the first shot, the first image that the viewer sees are these 2 blokes on the battlefield on the Western Front. And the viewer instinctively knows, don't ask me how, instinctively knows that they are brothers. And one of them is shot in the first moment of episode 1. But the viewer won't know until the last moment of episode 8 which brother was killed. And then he said, and from that scene on the battlefield, we immediately shoot to the family home in the suburb of Collingwood in Melbourne. And the family are gathered around the radio, and the Prime Minister is telling them that Australia is at war. And I said, it won't work like that. And he said, why not? It's a fabulous idea. And I said, it would be if we were going to relocate the First World War to begin in 1924. In that case, the purpose might be all right, but I instantly realised there's going to be a hell of a lot of work in getting the history a little bit right.
I think we can all sympathise with that. One can also think about many of the essays that we get to mark that have similar sorts of stories. Neil, I think we've perhaps given you enough time to have a drink and let the throat recover a bit. So I'm wondering if you could also perhaps reflect for us on some of the difficulties maybe that you've encountered in putting together TV history, not the book so much, but the visual side. And I'm wondering too, also thinking about what you were saying earlier, military history and social history seem to be the dominant areas that television does very well. Political history perhaps less so, although I did love your point towards the end about linking into British policy in South Africa. But I wonder if that's considered in the making of programs, and whether perhaps we marginalise politics even more than it already appears to be at the moment. We talk frequently with our students being disengaged with the party political system and big issues. So does that ever feature in the way that you try to construct the programs?
I think the answer is illustrated in the experience that we had with the final episode of A History of Scotland, which was by a country mile the most difficult to put together, because we had, when you're talking about Tacitus and Mons Graupius and the Roman invasion of Scotland, you can play it pretty fast and loose with what happens. But when you come into the realm where you've got television archive and events that are well within people's living memory, you have to be much more careful. And so the last episode included things like the collapse of heavy industry in Scotland, as many people saw it at the time, under Margaret Thatcher, and obviously that has all been rehearsed again in the last couple of weeks with Margaret Thatcher's death, and also the smouldering desire that there was for a long time before it happened, the smouldering desire for a recreated Scottish Parliament. And we agonised and agonised and agonised over how to be as even-handed as we thought we possibly could be, because as the BBC, we were contractually obliged to not have a political agenda, just to be telling a straight, objective story. So we agonised over it, and the episode went out. And within days of it going out, I was being stopped in the street by Scottish nationalists who accused me to my face of having given the typewriter over to the Labour Party, the Unionist Party, to construct that final episode. And then at the same time, during the same period, Unionist Labour supporters were coming up to me in the street and saying that we had given the typewriter to Alex Salmond, the leader of the Scottish National Party, and let him write it. So for all our efforts to tread a completely even-handed line, both extremes of the political spectrum saw that they had been mistreated and marginalised in our telling of the story. So I think the lesson that we learned was that no matter what you do, no matter what care you take, people will read into a television episode. They will see in it what they want to see. I was quite, to make it personal, I was quite ambivalent about it, because the series became so controversial back home that it was making headlines in national newspapers, which we hadn't expected at all. And in no small part, it was down to the fact that a lot of the academic... Now, I can to give you an idea of the care that we took, each of the 10 episodes of the series had what we called a godmother or a godfather appointed to it. And each godmother or godfather was a professional academic historian that we'd found and taken great care to have recommended to us, who was supposed to be the leading expert in the field, whatever subject we were covering in each episode. And they were able to view the scripts and make sure that everything we were doing was appropriate. But despite all of those efforts, there was a huge amount of criticism heaped on the series by the academic community. And it was down in no small part to the fact that, as I was saying today, I'm not a historian. I am an archaeologist, but I'm not a historian. And that, for the academic community, meant that I was effectively outside the tent pissing in, rather than inside the tent pissing out. And they just didn't like it. And I ended up with headlines in newspapers where I was described by a professor as looking like an escapee from Braveheart. Which, frankly, I was delighted about. And then later on, there were two particular professors who were steadfast in their criticism of the series, and I eventually lost my patience with a journalist who was asking me about it, and I said that for me they were like the two grumpy old men in the Muppet Show. And I called them the Statler and Waldorf of Scottish history, which generated the headline, Oliver labels top historians Muppets. But the reason why I'm ambivalent about it was all the controversy meant that the series attracted a lot more. I mean, the criticism started from episode 1, and the criticism of it just meant that more people watched the programme, because it was this people had to watch it to see what on earth was causing so much of a fuss. So I think I would say that I am a populist, unashamedly. I'm an enthusiast. And for me, I'm judicious about the projects that I get involved in, and they have to have what I would regard as a certain amount of gravitas and a certain serious tone. But for me, anything that makes people talk about and strike up a debate about history is fantastic. Braveheart, the thing that I was accused of being an escapee from, was riddled with historical inaccuracies. I mean, it's farcical in many respects, but nonetheless, it made people talk about and made people interested in the Scottish Wars of Independence at a time when events from the 13th century were really not on they were not the talk of the top deck of the number 9 bus. But suddenly, as a result of Braveheart, people were talking about that subject. And it was up to those people to identify the myths, identify the mistakes. But the mere fact that the film opened the door to people, I thought made it worthwhile. And I'm also, because I'm not part of the academic community, I'm not hostage to the terrifying world of peer review, which I do sympathise with. I mean, I have friends who are academics, and I know how the tightrope that they walk in trying to not say anything that anyone could shoot them down for. So I can understand the fear of peer review, but I live outside that world. You know, I am outside that tent. And for me, whatever it is, as long as it makes people talk about and think about history, that's fine by me.
I'll just pick up one or two themes from Neil there, and perhaps give a perspective on the other side of the tent. I was going to say fence. I've also, from time to time, get a little bit of mail and messages connected to some things that I've written or published. Not as much fan mail as Neil, quite obviously, but quite a bit of hate mail about some of these things. This is not a harmless or entirely harmless phenomenon. I'm a military historian, which means, as you probably guess, the white elephant in the room is always Anzac. It is in the classroom, it is in the publishing community, it is in the community. But I'm also a historian. I mentioned at the start, my purpose or my motivation here is to try and get as close to things as we can as historians, accepting all those theoretical arguments about the knowability of knowledge, to get to the close enough to things to explain them. And that puts me, and has put me at odds with some popular interpretation of Australia's military past. It's led to labels of communism, amongst other things, a little bit further left than left, as well as questioning of my sexuality and my parents and all those sorts of things. I guess that goes with the turf, but I guess the point I'm making here is that there are popular conceptions of history. And I think the wider point I'm making is bad history is not innocuous. You know, it has an impact, and it has most of its impact not in a university, but in the community. When it perpetuates myths and stereotypes, narrowness of attitudes and interpretations, that's not innocent. But I also recognise that, at least what I do, impinges upon or rubs up against personal feelings of identity or community feelings of identity. And I'm not out to upset that. But for me, when the two come into conflict, the integrity is important. Not everybody feels that way. Not everybody says thank you. And no one can be a harsher critic than other academics, except the public when they don't necessarily like what's being put out there. And then I'm just the pointy-headed academic writing for each other with the Chardonnay sipping, yeah, all the rest of it. Yeah, I just thought I'd give another point of view in that regard, I guess.
Can I just ask for an example of the kind of bad history that you're talking about? You know, what are there things that you're thinking about but not mentioning that you see as being less than innocuous?
I won't I won't name names and
Name names,
books.
go on,
No,
name
I
names.
won't do that. But to a certain degree, Neil, I don't need to. Everyone in the audience has no doubt, probably has walked down the corridor of a Dymocks bookstore and maybe even glanced at the military history section. I will get you half a dozen books off there whose idea of research is to make up conversations between Billy and Bluey that never existed. Yeah? And those conversations, and it goes back to that purpose that I talked about at the start. Anyone here can write that sort of stuff that is for a purpose, and that purpose is a market, and that purpose is to perpetuate conceptions of things that already exist, because it'll resonate. And I know it'll resonate because people love to hear it for ahistorical reasons and love to buy it. Yeah? That's out there. It's out there in the documentary and film sort of area as well. I guess I don't have as much contact with that as I do for books. My simple point is that, I mean, is it positive in that it keeps publishers interested in history that does have integrity? Yes. Keeps the market active? Yes. Does it inspire people to read the book next door? I hope it does. But in itself, it's just not entirely innocent, is a point I was making.
I suppose the problem always is that, you're talking about a popular work that's making up conversations between people that didn't exist, and you're able to identify that as laughable and wrong. The problem is, I suppose, that historians rely on documentary sources, and in 1,000 years' time, or looking back 1,000 years, the sources that are relied upon and treated as sacred texts simply because they're 1,000 years old, they may well have been written 1,000 years ago by somebody who is every bit as inept and motivated by suspect agenda than somebody writing about fictional conversations that took place 100 years ago. So I suppose that's part of the I'm not criticising there. That's part of the fascination for me, that we know that whether or not the things that are written or broadcast today are accurate, because we're able to make those judgments on them about the events that happen within our own lifetime. But we look back and venerate texts from the past and treat them as gospel, and yet they were, in many cases, they were just the tabloid newspapers of the day, or they were written by diarists who had their own agenda and were seeking the approval of a king or some other aristocrat, and they were every bit as inaccurate. And yet, by dint of 1,000 years of time past, they're glossed as verbatim.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I wouldn't argue against that at all, except to say that relying on a single source, however venerated, probably wouldn't be a good method. However, what I was more referring to is conversations like, no, if I say that, you'll pick the author. Ones that, let's say, appeal to the ethnic chauvinism of Australians as a reading audience, ones that denigrate other ethnicities on account of that, particularly those we've fought against, those that perpetuate some of the negative stereotypes or forces within the community. But there's mileage in doing so for this particular topic or this field.
I'm going to put Craig on the spot, I think. Doesn't sound like this is... Yeah, no, we're still there. Craig, you mentioned some people might have ahistorical reasons for what they write. Would you like to share some of your thoughts on that?
Well, perhaps a historian's reasonings rather than ahistorical. I mean, the danger here with popular history for me is, and popular is the wrong word, the danger for bad history that happens to be popular is that it is written to make some cash. If it's written to make some cash, it has to appeal to a market, and whoever is employed as a marketeer thinks will sell. So someone is judging out there what will sell and scoping a project around that. That's not, for me, the motivations or the true motivations for a work of history. And it can lead, and in some ways, at least in my field, it has to lead to a certain set of conclusions. Because if it doesn't, you're not going to sell, you're going to get hate mail.
People, we have a short amount of time before lunch, so looks like Nick's got a question first up. Yep.
Question particularly for Craig and Michael. Does it worry you that Peter Weir's Gallipoli, which I've been led to believe by somebody who did his PhD on the campaign, is semi-historical at best, does it worry you that Gallipoli is the most common experience of Australian school children in learning about the Gallipoli campaign?
One of the things at the War Memorial we used to ponder, and I started working there in 1981, so that's a fair time ago, and I think Peter Weirs Gallipoli is 1980, so it's about the same time. And one of the things we used to ponder at the War Memorial is what was going to happen when our audience went away. Because the old men, and I use that term advisedly, who were responsible for the memorial in those days, had the vision that it was a place for those who had participated. And when they died, be they First World War men who were beginning to die out in quite big numbers, or subsequently Second World War men, what was going to happen? At the same time, we noticed we weren't in the dying business at all. We were in a flourishing business because huge numbers, particularly of young people, were becoming interested in our field of specialty. And I went with the 60-plus old men who returned to Anzac for the 75th anniversary in 1990. Now, very strange government decision to take, 60 very old men back to Gallipoli, quite a hazardous decision. And the oldest of them turned 105, pleasingly enough, on Anzac Day. So we had a bit of a party at the motel that he was at, and the Royal Australian Navy's task was to land the beer, and yes, of course, they landed the beer at the wrong spot. But we had a ceremony up at Lone Pine. They'd been at the dawn service, and it was harder to see things at the dawn service, but up at Lone Pine. And the astonishing thing was that we realised that there were about 10,000 young Australians there. And it's not an easy place to get to. And there was no buses laid on or anything like that. And I decided that they'd constructed a race down which the old men would walk at the end of the Lone Pine service. And I thought I'd take photographs of each of the old men as they walked past because I thought it'd be really interesting to see the looks on their faces after all this time. Of course, none of them could remember anything about it. The landscape had changed so dramatically that it was quite difficult for them. What I didn't notice was that while I was taking the photos of these old men, I was also taking the photos of young Australians looking at them. And the look was of, a bit of a Bill Hayden moment again, isn't it? The look was of great reverence, but it said to me, I am so lucky that I am here present with men of history, that these men made our past, and I'm actually able to touch them and talk to them. And that was an amazing experience. So we were wrong when we thought it was going to die away, and we then, to get to your point, started thinking, well, maybe Peter Weir's film had done it. Maybe it's a temporary phenomenon. But if Peter Weir's film is still working in the classroom, then my goodness, that's amazing. Look, I don't have any problem with the film at all, and I think the last scene is as good a depiction of the tragedy at the Neck as you're ever going to see. And when I take battlefield tours and I stand people on the Neck, I realise I haven't got the words to convey the horror of what happened. And so I just read out Charles Bean, about 3 paragraphs of Charles Bean, who wrote with rising anger, in his study in 1925 or whatever it was, describing that action. And I think that for all the nonsense that goes before and all the tomfoolery and stuff like that, that film alone for the last 5 minutes is worth the price of the admission and worth showing to your students for the true horror of the Gallipoli campaign. And then if you can move them on from that, if you were interested in military history, and tell them that France is about 50 times worse, then you're doing a good job. Sorry for such a long answer.
I'd just like to add to that I mentioned the film Zulu, and you could write many, many books about the things that are wrong with Zulu from a historical perspective, but one of the things that does leap out from it is that the script was written by John Preble, a popular historian, in the 1960s. And the whole thing, the project was driven by Stanley Baker, who was passionate about the Welsh involvement in the Siege of Rorke's Drift. And the two factors together, Stanley Baker and John Preble's 1960s sensibilities, meant that you had the scene at the end of the film where the fighting is over and John Chard, who's played by Stanley Baker, and Gonville Bromhead, played by Michael Caine, are having a conversation. Michael Caine says to, Bromhead says to Chard, "You must have seen this before. How did you feel when you saw your first battlefield?" And John Chard says, "Do you think I could stand this butcher's yard more than once?" Which, in the light of the kind of imperial soldiers who took part in Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift, they were old hands who'd fought their way across southern Africa for years, and they were hardened professional soldiers, and they certainly weren't going to be, it was routine business, to fight and to see heaps of slain. That was just the nature of it for professional soldiers. And that's only one of the inaccurate. The Welsh involvement in Rorke's Drift is actually very small. It was largely men from Birmingham in the north of England who were at Rorke's Drift. But the point I'm making is that the whole fascination with the Anglo-Zulu War and the books that have been produced subsequent, brilliant works based on proper research, and there are so many wonderful, accurate accounts of the Anglo-Zulu War. Almost every author that you talk to who produced them was inspired to pursue the subject because when he was a little boy, he watched Michael Caine and Stanley Baker in Zulu. So it did its job. It may be completely farcical in many respects, but it inspired and it in turn produced proper historical research. And what we know about and understand about the Anglo-Zulu War now is due in no small part to John Preble and Stanley Baker wanting to make a film about a childhood fascination.
Notice he's not using the microphone when he says that.
But the whole Celtic and Rangers phenomenon is a fascination in Scotland. You're either part of it as a supporter one way or the other, or you're an observer of it, that in any event the Celtic and Rangers duality is a national obsession. But I think, obviously the situation has changed now, recent event regarding the fate of Rangers. But I can honestly say I am an unbiased observer.
Can I ask one more question? Yeah, my other question is for Neil, but it's also for the other panelists. I noticed, Neil, when you were speaking, and I wanted to ask you about devolution in Scotland.
I was waiting for this. Yeah, I see myself. I'd have to say I'm a unionist. I'm in support of a united Britain. It's not really anything to do with patriotism for me. It's a purely pragmatic decision. I just think that continuing subdivision of something that's already small just doesn't seem like a logical thing to me. I mean, Britain's a very small place, and a United Kingdom sort of makes the most of it. And to split it down into its constituent parts, I don't see in whose long-term gain that actually is. But that's not to say that I'm any less proud to be Scottish. And I'm proud to be Scottish because I know the contribution, and you're touching on it, a lot of that, there was a great deal of patriotism and pride of country came out of Scotland's contribution to the First World War. So I don't see any split between it. I see myself 100% Scottish and 100% British, and I don't see any. For me, there's no difference between the two.
I think it's very interesting question. And if I was going to say or identify in my own students a single really important, not weakness, but difficulty that they have when you're talking about early 20th century, late 19th century history, is the duality of Australian identity that you flagged. It's a real problem for students to grasp. I think it's a problem for people to grasp more generally. The fact that you can at once be a reader of the Bulletin in the 1880s and call yourself a nationalist, but also a proud member of empire. And remember, the empire's at its height, 1880s, 1890s. So one of the things that's missing, perhaps in that movie, or the retrospective tales we tell about World War I and the Boer War, which is important as well, we forget. One of the things that we miss in projecting current ideas about Australian identity and nationalism backwards is the fact that it was much more complicated than that. I mean, it just wasn't that way. So the sorts of tensions that we can read back is to the dichotomy we sent up. Is this decision in an Australian interest? Is it in Britain's interest? Why do we do that? That was clearly a silly thing to do. All of them make no sense unless we've got some grasp of that nature of identity of the period. So I think that is an issue for, I'm not going to say popular history, but history, even recent history, dealing with the turn of the century, not so far ago.
I think the two questions arising out of the First World War that I just don't understand in relation to Australia are firstly how it was that the Australian churches that made such a hash of any sensible response to the war continued to claim adherence in the years after the war. And I just don't understand why that is. And the second one that I don't understand is why it was when we knew what had happened, when, for example, Ross McMullen recently writing about Fromell, saying it is without doubt the worst day in Australian history ever, the most tragic day in Australian history ever, when 5,500 Australians became casualties in a few hours for a mad British general's vanity. How it was arising out of the First World War that we maintained the Union Jack in the corner of our flag and if you like, no, not if you like, because I think it's the case, an even more subservient relationship with Britain in the 20s, 30s and 40s. How was it? Billy Hughes said this with the fall of Singapore. Would they please take the leadership of the United Kingdom out of the guilty hands of that arch-idiot Churchill, who has just led the British Empire into the worst defeat it's ever suffered, and we can't, out here, stop thinking about what he did to us at Gallipoli. And why was Billy Hughes the only one saying that? So I have those two issues arising from the First World War. I just don't understand what the answer is. I think, both of the other two answers are far more restrained than mine. But then I'm the idiot on the panel. I'm up here for the jokes.
I won't comment at all on that one, Michael. We have one final question. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, you have to have a mic because they're live streaming.
I just wanted to add to this discussion about popular history as a history teacher who uses Gallipoli in a classroom, that I think what we need to add to this conversation is not necessarily whether we should use popular history, but how we use it. Because, for instance, I think Gallipoli, as you say, the ending is very good, and there are many students that walk out of it going, it's a terrible movie because it has such a horrible ending. And I think that's actually quite a powerful tool because it gets them to think about the anti-war message. But also, Neil, you mentioned Tacitus and the problems inherent in all sources. And I think that's very valid because Gallipoli itself can be studied as a primary source. It comes from a time outside of World War I, and it has a very strong anti-British bias, which is a product of a different time. So if you're using popular history, you use it as a tool to integrate critical thinking and analysis, and the very process and integrity of history is to ask the purpose of the source. And I think popular history can be very helpful in that regard.
As I mentioned, I've been involved in this project about the experience of some men from Skye who ended up in a battle called Festubert, not far from Fromell, in fact, very close indeed. And the historian that I was working with, Trevor Royal, who some of you on the panel may have run across his work. He's written extensively about the Great War. And I was asking him about at which point in the aftermath of the First World War it became regarded as an apocalyptic event, and all the stuff about lions led by donkeys and all of that view. I mean, we look back on the First World War as this disaster, and it was certainly an enormous loss of life, but we look back on it as an act of incompetence. And I said, when did that start? Because he was at pains to say that during the war, certainly British soldiers of all ranks remained fond of their commanders right through, even when they were in the midst of disastrous fights. And he said that it was due in no small part to the impact of the war poets, like Sassoon. So you're a small cadre of men who began who were producing work about the horror and the tragedy, and that worked its way right through the British perception of what the war had been all about, and switched it from something which up until about 1920 had been an object of pride, because after all the Allies won the war, and it swung away in the opposite direction. And you could say that the war poets were contributing in some regard to popular history, because they were producing an account of events that was consumed by a mass audience and changed everything. And yet you'd be hard pushed to find someone who would look back and say that someone like Sassoon was wrong or was only a populist. But I just think we've got. I completely understand. I'm not going to tackle the issue of Gallipoli, not in this august company. But I just think it's fascinating the way we think we know what happened. At any given moment, we think we know what happened then. But you give it 20 years and something entirely different comes up. And 20 years from now, your, as a nation's impression of Gallipoli will likely be different again, because it has changed over the years. But that's part of the fascination for me.